July 20th, 1944, a single ordinary-sounding date, but one that rings like an alarm across the pages of 20th century history. Picture the Wolf's Lair, a cluster of camouflaged wooden huts rammed into a pine forest in East Prussia, guarded, secretive, and purpose-built to be a fortress for the Führer. Inside one of those huts, a group of officers sits around a long table. Maps are spread out like islands. Paper, pens, the smell of cigarette smoke and pipe tobacco, the murmur of tactical briefings. Then, in an instant, a blast, thick black smoke, splintered wood, the shrill of alarms. Men fall, maps burn. For a moment, it seems as if the center of the Nazi world has been blown apart. But the most important question isn't the explosion itself, it's how close that explosion came to changing everything. How close did Nazi Germany come to collapsing from the inside? This is the story of Operation Valkyrie, the most serious attempt to assassinate Adolf Hitler during the Second World War. It is a story of courage and moral crisis, of a conspiracy inside the very army Hitler trusted most, and of how small, practical details, like a briefcase moved a few feet, can alter the course of history. Germany in 1944 was a country running out of options. From the outside, it looked like a house already on fire. The Allies had landed in Normandy in June, opening a western front that ripped open the continent from the Atlantic. In the east, Soviet forces pushed relentlessly, reclaiming ground and pulverizing German formations. The Allied air campaign flattened cities, night after night, turning urban centers into rubble and ash. Supply lines were frayed. Morale, already pummeled by years of total war, was fraying further. Inside the German military and the conservative elites around it, a grim realization settled in. They were not merely losing battles, they were moving toward catastrophe. The strategic logic didn't need poetic argument. The numbers, the retreats, the collapsing fronts said it plainly. But beyond the military calculus lay a moral dimension. For some officers, this wasn't only about winning or losing. It was about preventing the total destruction of Germany and the further commission of crimes that already stained their conscience. If Hitler continued to rule, many of them believed Germany faced annihilation and moral ruin. They began to ask the unthinkable: what would happen if Hitler were removed? Into that moral and military stew stepped Colonel Claus von Stauffenberg. He was an aristocrat by birth, a professional soldier by training, a man who wore loyalty like a uniform, but one whose loyalties had unraveled. Stauffenberg's journey from loyal officer to conspirator is a study in disillusionment. He'd fought in Poland and France, but the Eastern Front changed him. He saw brutality and orders that left civilians and prisoners vulnerable to atrocity. The scale and direction of Nazi policy and the steady slide toward catastrophic defeat convinced him that Hitler's removal was a moral imperative. Stauffenberg's readiness to act was not abstract. He'd been grievously wounded in North Africa earlier in the war. He lost his right hand, 2 fingers on his left, and an eye. Those injuries might have been enough to push a man away from active service. For Stauffenberg, they hardened his resolve. Despite his disabilities, he maneuvered himself into positions where he could influence events. Crucially, he gained access to Hitler's military briefings at the Wolf's Lair, the rare opening that made the assassination attempt possible. Now the plan itself. At first glance, it can sound almost simple. Kill Hitler. Activate a plan called Valkyrie to take control of Berlin. Use the reserve army, the Reichsreserve Heer, to seize key positions and arrest key Nazi leaders. Then negotiate an end to the war that might save Germany from total annihilation. That simplicity is deceptive. Valkyrie was not an ad hoc name. It was an existing, legitimate emergency plan. Originally written to deal with internal unrest, it allowed the reserve army to mobilize in the event of chaos within the Reich riots, a coup, or other emergencies. The conspirators' stroke of political cunning was to take that legitimate official framework and repurpose it. They altered the wording, smuggled in new orders, and arranged for commanders in Berlin and across the Reich to execute the plan should Hitler be killed. Under false pretexts, they would claim the SS was attempting its own coup. The reserve army would move to seize control of the state apparatus, arrest the SS and top Nazi officials, and then, this was the delicate part, seek out terms with the Western Allies. This was no lone nut or isolated plot. Over 200 officers and civilians were involved at various levels. It included staff officers, regional commanders, and sympathetic politicians. Here's what made it so dangerous to the Nazi regime. It was not just an assassination attempt. It was a full military coup, organized from within the structures Hitler counted on. They had officers in reserve units, in communication centers, and in regional commands. It was perhaps the most organized resistance movement inside Nazi Germany, precisely because it used the Reich's own procedures against it. Then came July 20th. The plan looked like it might actually come together. Stauffenberg flew to East Prussia, carrying a briefcase. Inside were explosives, plastic charges shaped to do maximum damage, in a cramped conference room. He knew the risks. He knew the security. He knew that positioning the device close to Hitler was crucial, and that even small changes in distance could determine life or death. The conference that day was something of a misfortune in practical terms. It had been scheduled as a briefing in a bunker, concrete, heavy, an environment where a blast would concentrate and be most lethal. At the last minute, however, Hitler decided to move the meeting to a wooden barrack, a hut with open windows and less containment. That change alone reduced the blast's lethality. Stauffenberg did what he could. With his partially disabled hands, he armed the device, a fiddly, harrowing job that he completed with 3 fingers. He set the charge in a briefcase and placed it under the table, close to where he guessed Hitler would be. He left the room, his face calm on the outside, and a storm inside perhaps. He boarded a plane and returned to Berlin, convinced the deed was done. But reality has a way of slamming into plans with small, cruel details. In the conference room, an officer accounts vary on who shifted the briefcase behind a thick wooden table leg. That simple repositioning created an enormous shield between Hitler and the force of the blast. When the explosive detonated, the room rattled and men were thrown to the floor. 4 men died and several were gravely wounded, but Hitler survived. He sustained injuries, but they were not mortal. He walked, he spoke, and he used the event almost immediately as a boon to his own myth. Back in Berlin, the conspirators began to execute Valkyrie. The plan assumed that Hitler's death would be confirmed quickly and that commanders would obey the orders now circulating. For a few hours, the plot seemed like it might succeed. Some units mobilized, key installations were seized, and the coup's architects believed momentum was with them. But momentum needs clarity. And here the failure of clear information cost them everything. Confusion is the enemy of coups. The reserve army's officers hesitated. Some wanted confirmation. Others were unsure whether to accept a reality that seemed almost impossible, that Hitler could be dead. Meanwhile, loyal Nazi elements, including the SS and those still attached to Hitler's command, acted swiftly. News that Hitler had survived began to spread. Radio broadcasts insisted he was alive and in control. The German public, fed by loyalist radio and bewildering reports, began to panic and then to rally to the Führer. Once the myth of Hitler's invincibility was reasserted, the conspirators' plan collapsed. At midnight, the noose tightened. Stauffenberg and several co-conspirators were arrested. The frantic, brutal efficiency of the Nazi security apparatus reasserted itself with frightening speed. That same night, Stauffenberg and his close associates were executed by firing squad in a courtyard. The executions were meant to be quick answers, but they left a legacy far greater than the conspirators' deaths. The risk and moral complexity of resisting the regime were now burned into public knowledge. Hitler's response was fury shaped into an organized purge. He ordered mass arrests. The regime initiated an extraordinary wave of reprisals. Some 7,000 people were arrested, and nearly 5,000 were either executed or died in custody. Estimates vary depending on records and definitions, but the numbers are stark. The reprisals were designed not just to punish, but to terrorize. Show trials in the People's Court, led by Roland Freisler, were filmed to humiliate the accused. These trials were grotesque spectacles, rants and forced confessions, broadcast as cautionary tales. Methods of execution were sometimes cruelly inventive. Hanging with piano wire became a particularly notorious method, slow and horrific. Entire families of conspirators were punished. Wives, children, and relatives faced arrest, disappearance, and the stigma of Sippenhaft, the Nazi policy of kin liability. Children were taken away, raised by the regime, or simply vanished into the prison system. The aftermath left an indelible mark. Operation Valkyrie had failed. The internal resistance it embodied was temporarily crushed and publicized as traitorous. But the ripples it sent across German society and history cannot be contained to a neat victory for the regime. The conspiracy demonstrated that even within the Wehrmacht, the heart of Hitler's power base, there were men prepared to risk everything to stop him. They were not a monolithic block of resistance, but they were real, organized, and determined. Historians still debate the counterfactuals. What might have been if the bomb had worked as intended and Hitler had died? Would German officers have been able to consolidate power quickly enough? Could they have negotiated a separate peace with the Western Allies? How would the Soviets have reacted? Would an early removal of Hitler have spared cities from bombardment or populations from deportation? It's hard to answer with certainty. The Allies had publicly insisted on unconditional surrender. They were deeply suspicious of any German regime that might try to preserve elements of the Nazi state or avoid full dismantlement. The Soviets would have been incredulous and possibly vindictive about any solution that left large swathes of territory contested. Yet for many, the more immediate question is human. How many lives might have been saved in the late months of the war? Could concentration camp prisoners have faced earlier liberation and less suffering? Would cities like Warsaw, Budapest, or even parts of Germany itself have been spared late destruction? These are urgent, painful what-ifs. We will never have definitive answers. The complexity of geopolitics, the brutal logic of retribution, and the sheer momentum of war make simple conclusions impossible. Nevertheless, thinking through those questions helps underscore the sheer weight of the conspirators' gamble. They believed not just that Hitler had to die, but that his death might allow a measure of salvage for a wrecked country. But the story of Valkyrie also leaves a more specific legacy. It forces us to recognize that not all Germans were complicit in the Nazi project. Some resisted, even from within the military's highest ranks. It complicates the narrative of total unanimity behind Hitler and shows how moral and political courage can exist even amid monstrous crimes. It also highlights the fragility of history, how small contingencies, like a briefcase moved a few feet, can steer entire epochs. On July 20th, 1944, history almost changed. A wooden table leg, an open window, a couple of seconds of hesitation. These are the granular contingencies that make historical events human and painfully contingent. Operation Valkyrie did not topple Hitler. It did not end the war, but it revealed the depth of opposition within Germany and the human capacity to act at extraordinary risk when conscience demands it. When you picture that day, think about the sensory details, the pine-scented air of East Prussia, the cramped warmth of a wooden briefing hut, the scrape of boots on floorboards, the metallic click of a timer being set by a man with 3 fingers, the sudden roar of an explosion, and then the hush of stunned disbelief. Remember the human faces, those who plotted in secret, those who executed orders, those who died in the blast, and those who paid later with their lives and the lives of their families. Operation Valkyrie remains one of the most dramatic episodes of internal resistance in Nazi Germany. It is at once a tale of practical planning and moral reckoning, and a reminder that within monstrous systems, people still make choices, sometimes heroic, sometimes cowardly, sometimes tragically partial. The coup's failure didn't erase the courage of those who acted. Their effort continues to provoke questions about duty, about betrayal and loyalty, and about what it costs to stand against tyranny. If you find yourself wondering how different the world might be if Hitler had died that day, you're not alone. The counterfactuals matter because they point to the stakes people faced: millions of lives, entire cities, the moral shape of a nation. We'll never get a definitive answer, but the attempt itself speaks to the broader truth that in the midst of catastrophe, some people chose to attempt to stop it. That decision, regardless of its outcome, deserves to be remembered. So when you think back to July 20th, 1944, don't fixate only on the blast. Think about the motives and the consequences. Think about Stauffenberg, not as a caricature, but as a deeply conflicted person who chose to act. Think about the other conspirators, their plans, and the fatal domino of mischance that turned near success into a terrifying failure. Operation Valkyrie almost worked. It didn't. But in failing, it showed something essential. Even in the darkest of regimes, some people will risk everything to try to end the suffering. Thanks for spending these minutes with the story. If this peek into one of the most dramatic missed turns in WWII history intrigued you, leave your thoughts below. If the bomb had worked, what do you think would have happened next?